Well, hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to today's program, Spotlight on Ukraine, a conversation on Russian sanctions. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Susan Elliott. I'm the president and CEO of the National Committee on American Foreign Policy. And on behalf of our members and board of trustees, I want to welcome you to today's program. We're really pleased that you're here, and we think that this is just such an important discussion to have on, the use of sanctions and how that will affect the behavior of the Russian government. It's a topic that even since we began to plan this program has changed. Things have changed day by day, since hour by hour, since February 24th, when Russia invaded Ukraine. And as we saw yesterday, President Biden announced US sanctions against the Russian energy sector. The UK has also taken similar actions, and I know that countries of the European Union are discussing if they would be able to do the same. Since Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, the US has imposed sanctions, various kinds of sanctions, on Russian individuals, assets, and businesses. However, as we've seen, these sanctions really didn't seem, especially in this case, to stop what Russia is doing and from conducting other nefarious activities like SolarWinds cyber attacks and interference in the US elections. Now that Russia has launched this full-scale military invasion of Ukraine, the US, in conjunction with various allies and partners, has imposed some of the harshest economic and political sanctions available upon the Russian Central Bank, the National Wealth Fund, as well as barring Russian access to the SWIFT financial system. The European Union also has taken strong action, in some cases in as little as 24 hours, which is really historic that the European Union could take actions in such a swift and strong way. And the Biden administration also, I think, is taking a leadership role in encouraging both private and public sectors to terminate energy partnerships with Russia. And in fact, as we've all seen in the past few days, the German government suspended the certification of the Nordstream 2 pipeline. The list of companies exiting their obligations with Russian entities continues to grow. Just yesterday, for Americans, we've seen that McDonald's, Coca-Cola, Pepsi, and Starbucks announced that they would cease operations in Russia. And we know that, especially for McDonald's, having lived in Moscow myself, the closing of all the McDonald's restaurants, I think, is quite significant. But there are other companies from all sectors that have done the same. We've seen MasterCard, Visa, Exxon Mobil, Boeing, Estee Lauder, Ford, General Motors, FedEx, Netflix, just to name a few of the many companies that have suspended doing business with Russia. And as a result, the Russian ruble is now worth less than 1 cent to the US dollar. Kind of unbelievable. But I guess the question that we want to explore today is, what will these sanctions mean, not only for the actions of President Putin, but what will the reciprocal effects and the unintended consequences be for not only the US economy, but for the economies of our European friends and other friends and allies around the world? And how long will the countries imposing sanctions be able to sustain them? That's another question that I think is a really important one we need to explore. Russia is one of the largest energy producers in the world, and Europe is a chief consumer, and they're very reliant on Russian natural gas imports. So will Europe be able to sanction Russian natural gas imports? And how will Europe and the US, if this happens, make up for the shortfall? As economic conditions worsen, how will the average Russian citizen be affected? And how will President Putin spin this blame on a crisis to his domestic audience? And another thing is, are the sanctions the only mechanism, shy of military or kinetic force, to stop the Russian military and political advances in Ukraine? So I've laid out a very ambitious agenda for the next hour. And I want to first tell you we have two outstanding experts today to discuss these issues and to help us try to put them into perspective. How will these sanctions, how will economic actions that the US takes affect not just the Russian economy, but what will be the side effects that it will have on the US country and to the US economy and to the economies of our allies and partners. So first, let me introduce our speakers. We have Professor Alexander Cooley, who is the Claire Tao Professor of Political Science at Barnard College at Columbia University. He's also served as the director of Columbia University's Harriman Institute in the study of Russia, Eurasia, and Eastern Europe. He's done extensive research on the countries of the former Soviet Union with a focus on Central Asia and the Caucasus, but he also has written several books, too many for me to mention today, and has been the author of numerous publications on the countries of former Soviet Union and the region. We also have Ambassador Steve Mann with us today. He has had a distinguished career both as a US diplomat and as a member of Exxon Mobil Corporation's International Government Relations Group. During his diplomatic career, where he was a colleague and a friend of mine, he specialized in former Soviet Union and South Asia, and also maintained a focus on energy diplomacy, including serving as the coordinator for Eurasian energy diplomacy, managing all US government diplomatic efforts on Eurasian gas and oil issues. He also served as US ambassador to Turkmenistan, an exporter of energy, as well as principal deputy assistant secretary of state for the Bureau of South and Central Asian Affairs. And when he was there, he oversaw a full range of foreign policy matters in the region, including beyond the former Soviet Union into South Asia with India and Pakistan. So before we get started on our discussion, just a reminder to everyone that the program is on the record, it's being recorded, and we will post the recording on the NCFP YouTube channel after the program. And we'll start the program with Alex, Steve, and I having a discussion of some of the issues that I just posed. And then we will entertain questions from the audience. If you have a question, you may look at the bottom of your screen and submit them in the Q&A function. And we will try to get to as many questions as we can during the 1-hour program. We fortunately have already had several questions submitted ahead of time, so I know we're going to have a robust and great discussion. So let me start out, and maybe Steve, I'll start out with you. I've just sort of made an outline of the sanctions that the U.S. and the Europeans and other countries have already imposed, but are they enough? I mean, what do you think in terms of what President Biden did on the Russian energy yesterday? We don't import as much Russian energy as our European friends and allies do, but what's your perspective about these sanctions? Will they change President Putin's behavior?
Well, thanks very much, Susan. And again, thanks so much for asking me to do this. A key is not to ask more of sanctions than sanctions can do. So they are not magic weapons. And some, particularly in the US Congress, have sort of imbued them with this greater power. They work well as part of what I would call a combined arms approach for diplomacy, where you have to put them together with the alliance building and diplomacy, with the military force, and with the sanctions. So when we bring that to the current day, energy is Russia's lifeblood. I mean, that's generally acknowledged. It takes me back to a 2014 conversation I had with a senior State Department official who said, Russia is a petrostate. That's why we've got to target oil. This in response to the first Russian invasion of Ukraine. But those energy sanctions back then were pretty ineffective. After those sanctions, Russia hit new record levels of oil production at over 11 million barrels a day. And the net effect on Russian GDP of all sanctions back then was a scant 0.2% of GDP being knocked off. Now we come to the current day, and these are impressive sanctions with the alliance unity, the speed, and the force. And these sanctions focus on financial targets. And I think that's the right thing to do because energy is tricky. Two quick reasons. One is on gas. Europe is locked into this long-term gas infrastructure on which so much of its economy depends, not just heating, but also generating electricity to power the factories and businesses of Europe. Secondly, oil is fungible globally. So if you take some Russian oil off the market in Europe, that oil may then appear through different transmission channels for consumers in India, in China, in Latin America. So it's tricky, but President Biden did the right thing, I believe, both symbolically and tangibly in shutting off US oil exports. It's a bit more of a challenge for the Europeans, but more and more, this sanctions pressure on oil is going to be felt, really, whether or not formal European sanctions follow.
Well, you know, one of the things, Alex, you're an expert on, former Soviet Union and especially Central Asia and the Caucasus. But in addition to energy, which is the lifeblood of countries like Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan, but what about even the broader financial sanctions? I mean, what do you think? How will this affect not only our European friends and allies, but our countries and friends of countries of former Soviet Union?
Yeah, it's a great question, and thank you for the invite. It's a pleasure to be with you, Ambassador Elliott and Ambassador Mann. Look, I think we have to acknowledge the neighborhood that the Central Asian countries are in. And they live in a neighborhood that consists of proximity to both Russia and China, and an incorporation increasingly into Russian and Chinese regional what I call ordering projects. So these links, this integration is much deeper than it was, say, even 10, 15 years ago. And so there are certain fallouts that they can't escape. So for instance, one of the first things that the Russian foreign policy community establishment did is to try and conduct negotiations with members of the Eurasian Economic Union, right, to see what kinds of workarounds they could come up on sanctions. Now, in 2014, the Eurasian Economic Union was established. It was fast forwarded as a result of what happened in Crimea, right? It was one of the ways that Putin wanted to demonstrate, we have other alternatives. We're going to pivot to the east. We're going to, so he concluded the gas deal, the power of Siberia, and fast forwarded the conclusion, the EAU. Now, this locks in the Central Asian countries that are members into lockstep problems of sort of the devaluation of their currency. They are absolutely concerned about the blocking impact of these financial sanctions and transactions. They don't know what the impact of withdrawal from the Russian market is going to be of all these sort of Western companies. Now, these Western companies, some of them withdrew because of the sanctions, some for reputational reasons, some because of just very complicated supply chain reasons. But all of this has a very high degree of uncertainty associated with it. Now, Ambassador Mann's the expert here on Central Asian energy, but certainly just in recent days, conversations I've had with Kazakh officials, for instance, are absolutely concerned that they are now just reliant on a Trans-Caspian network to get their oil out. And even that is having severe problems because of some of the perceived toxicity of not only oil that might be commingled, but also the geography of a port like Novorossiysk, which is so close to the shelling Mariupol, and again, creates problems with shipping, transportation, and insurance. I think our Central Asian partners are in a really tough spot here. Yes, they absolutely are concerned about what is happening in Kiev. Let's not undersell that. And of course, given the comments that have been made before about northern Kazakhstan and the precarious nature of the Kazakh state, for instance, that concern is justified. But economically, they're faced with a neighborhood now that Russia is sanctioned, and they're tied to Russia through this economic arrangement. They don't have access to Iran still, nor do they have a waiver the way India does. And a lot of them that border Xinjiang now have this problem of having to limit trade with sanctioned entities because of the Xinjiang sanctions. So they don't have a lot of outs, especially if they're landlocked. So this is really a nightmare scenario for them.
Yeah, and I would think just having, served in as ambassador to Tajikistan, another aspect of how it would affect the economies is the migrant workers who go to Russia. And if the Russian economy is in tatters, what does that mean for Tajikistan, which close to 50% of its GDP is dependent on, at least it used to be, on remittances? So
yeah, thank you.
We've seen that. I mean, it may not have the effect yet, but I'm sure it certainly will in the future.
I think 2 points of concern there. Yes, you're absolutely right. So expecting the flow of remittances to stop or to be seriously devalued because of the currency pressures. Also, there's increasing concern amongst migrants that might be even drafted into the campaign. We've seen already Central Asians appear as contractors, driving trucks, some fighting and so forth. And so widespread concern that if this war continues in a protracted way, they might be mobilized into the effort. All of this might mean that they stay home or they don't engage in the seasonal rotations. That's one. The second related kind of social instability issue, very high commodity prices, especially food prices too, that are going to result from the uncertainty here. And, this is not a recipe for political and social stability in Central Asia. And of course, this is another concern. Governments of Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, right across the region.
Yeah, especially if, your remittances are in rubles, that's not very good right now. But what about you, Steve? I know you worked with not only, in Turkmenistan, but then for Exxon Mobil, and I know they have a lot of interest in Kazakhstan. And how do you think this will affect, especially U.S. energy companies who are functioning in the region?
Well, it's tough for the Kazakhs, and it's going to be a challenge for Chevron, for Exxon, for the other major companies operating there, because the great mass of Kazakh oil is evacuated through the CPC pipeline, which goes from Kazakhstan out to Novorossiysk. That's 1 million barrels a day.
Mm-hmm.
Now, CPC is partly owned by the Russian Federation. CPC also transmits some Russian oil into that pipeline, and what comes out is called CPC blend.
Mm-hmm.
CPC blend price has been dropping in the past few weeks because of sanctions fears, and traders aren't really sure how they're going to cope with handling CPC blend if Russian oil gets more widely sanctioned. That's one thing. Another thing you've got is tankers going into Novorossiysk are paying a war risk premium on insurance.
Wow.
And that is making Kazakh oil less attractive. So the Kazakhs have been looking at cross-Caspian, as Alex has said, cross-Caspian transport by barge into the BTC pipeline. But whenever you have to load and offload, that adds to your costs and decreases your profits also. So the Kazakhs are feeling the effects of this situation. The other interesting part of this is Azerbaijan. And a day before the Russian invasion, Ilham Aliyev went up to Moscow. And one of the things that emerged from that was a communique on gas exports that roughly it's kind of a non-compete with each other communique. So it's something to be factored in if anyone in Europe is looking for Azerbaijani gas to, let's say, backfill Gazprom. However, big however here, the pipeline route to get Azerbaijani gas into Europe is very small right now. It's 10 billion cubic meters a year compared to 155 BCMA of Russian gas going into Europe. So even if you find ways to loop back and compress, you're not going to get Azerbaijani gas or God knows Turkmen gas into Europe really anytime in years to come.
Mhm. So it really, I mean, well, we can see that it's not just affecting, Russia, but it definitely the neighbors in the region. But, and even looking beyond energy, and maybe Alex, you could answer this, or either one of you, but we know that Putin is a very skilled person, and that he's probably been planning this for a while. What do we think about how well insulated he's kept himself? So even as the economy feels this effect, do you think that he has insulated himself and perhaps others around so that it will take longer for at least the elites in Russia to feel the pain that the others are going to feel?
That's a great question. So, in preparation for this, certainly the Russians had amassed, over $600 billion worth of currency reserves. That was the so-called Putin war chest. And the discussions in Moscow in the lead up were more about the implications of being cut off from SWIFT, right? The question of central bank sanctions, particularly ones also that originated in the European Union, to my knowledge, wasn't really seriously considered or discussed. And now, lo and behold, they have access now to just the gold part of the portfolio. And we don't know the exact current numbers because they're only updated twice a year. That was 22% of the portfolio. And then yuan from China, about 13. And of course, those are illiquid. And of course, it's very difficult to sell gold in the quantities that's required for central bank types of operations and interventions. So that caught them unaware. I think the Western exodus caught them unaware. It's absolutely unprecedented what's happened, right? Within the span of sort of 10 days, we've disentangled Russia from the world economy. And this kind of bet that we had, hoping that 30 years of integration with the West would sort of work out, would socialize Russia, would get them to adapt certain norms, standards, rule of law, that I think we have to declare that a failure. But the third aspect of this I find really interesting too on the sanctions is this going after the oligarchs in a concerted fashion. And you've seen this from all, three sets of major actors, right? The EU, the UK on its own, and the US. In fact, we have set up an interagency task force to go after these particular assets. We saw some very high profile seizures of the yachts, Mr. Sechin, Mr. Usmanov in continental Europe. Now, I think this may make some anti-kleptocracy advocates, and I'm one of them, feel good. But in terms of a lever of change, I seriously doubt this is going to do much except sort of signal the old days are over. You can no longer be governed like Stalin and enjoy access to the French Riviera. The oligarchs themselves aren't in charge of Putin. It's the other way around. And the comments of Mr. Deripaska and others saying that they want peace, they're welcomed. But again, if our theory of change is that the oligarchs will pressure Putin into a changing stance, I'm afraid it's going to take that's going to take a while, if ever to happen. Just one more note on the oligarchs' sanctions. Seizing yachts is one thing, but seizing assets that have been squirreled away, camouflaged, hidden, dispersed is another thing. So this is a much longer process. So I think this gets back to the point that you made earlier, that, initially we have this, historic unity in terms of NATO coming together, the EU being on the same page, the imposition of sanctions, the arming of Ukraine. All of a sudden, the divisions that had characterized our policy towards Russia, in the West anyway, were swept away. But as we go on, which of these will become wedge issues? What is the commitment? And, not to mention, how can we sustain this in the absence of a clear political ask or a clear political outcome or goal that we're trying to achieve? And that's why we're using these sanctions. So a lot of open questions here, but I think it's the scale of the regime that Putin didn't anticipate. So he doesn't care for economics much. We've tried to make life as much, as difficult as possible, but he's the decision maker. And for him, this really transcends pain, economic rationality, all of these things. Yes, it is costly to him, but his natural inclination is to double down, not to retreat.
Yeah, and I want to get back to maybe in a minute what you said about, what would be, as a former diplomat, what would be, are there ways, obviously this is going to be hard to sustain these sanctions. And then are there ways that we could come, what's the political endgame? Are there ways that we could perhaps, come to some kind of a solution? But, in talking about, again, hitting the Russians in the energy, below the belt, what do you think, Steve? We talked a little bit about pipelines and, the Caspian region, but what about Nordstream 2? I mean, how long do we think that, the Germans will hold off on this, or is it completely dead? Will it never move forward? I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, first, let me briefly but warmly, as they say in the UN, associate myself fully with the comments of my colleague, Professor Cooley here, because who knew that there was going to be this sanctions unity? 8 years ago, Japan, South Korea, and other countries told NATO to go pound sand on sanctions. Now you've got Singapore, Switzerland aligned with this. It is remarkable. It's on oligarchs. I share the caution. There is no mechanism of action we can see for oligarchs to act on Putin. But I think it's critical that we counter this dirty money because Putin is presenting an ideological challenge to the West. And that is a challenge to erode rule of law and spread corruption. So we have to do that independently of Ukraine. On the pipelines, Nord Stream 2, is it's steel in the ground right now. It's been made an SDN by the US, so it is in sanctions terms, Nord Stream 2 is radioactive. Matthias Warnig, the CEO of Nord Stream 2, is an SDN. So I think it is going nowhere for any foreseeable future. Now, what Europe has to do is really get serious about energy security. It's been importing a lot of LNG, and that's expensive. Europe could do a lot more to bring its indigenous natural gas production back online. And of course, there's nuclear, which is a huge possibility here. And we saw a month ago, the European Commission proposing that natural gas and nuclear be considered within the green policies of the Commission. So that's the way forward. And yeah, I'm not expecting Nord Stream 2 to rise from the dead anytime soon.
Well, and what do you both think about, again, this could be to either one of you, think about not just US pressuring, but even Europeans to pressure other oil producing countries like Saudi Arabia or perhaps even Venezuela into helping, the Europeans, at least in the short term, releasing more oil and, helping out that way. Is that a possibility?
Well, let me just jump in quickly. My head cracks open at this, that the Biden administration is going to Venezuela while it is dragging its feet on US production. It takes 140 days for the administration to approve a drilling permit in the United States. It takes 2 days for Texas to approve a drilling permit. So you're going to Maduro and you're not encouraging it here. That said,
So having worked for Exxon, I mean, do you think that's something, because to me, that would be the logical thing, is that, you know, why aren't we going to our own companies and asking them, even though it's not something maybe that the Biden administration is wanting to do in the long term, but in the short term, you know, activating leases and starting more drilling might be, or exploration might be the thing we need to do.
yeah, fundamentally, the asks have little weight because it is price signals that's going to move more oil onto the market. And the Biden administration should be making that development of oil easier. But it's price that's going to move it. They can, you know, go all around, but in the long term, that $130 oil is a powerful incentive there.
Well, we have a lot of questions from the audience, but before we move to the audience, there's one other question that I'd like to ask both of you, and this is in relation to China. You know, I think that's what everyone is wondering now. What's President Xi going to do? We saw that Putin, you know, went to China at the beginning of the Olympics, and you know, how will China react to the sanctions? Will they impose them? Will they be an off-ramp for Putin? I'm wondering what each of you think, especially because China has been active in Central Asia, but you know, what do either of you think about, you know, China's role in this? Do you think China would maybe speak out and try not to be as supportive of Putin?
I'll take a first stab. I think my quick answer is no. China will look out for their interests, both in the short term and over the longer term, and that they will give symbolic support and public support in their media to Putin, a strategic partnership, where they seriously risk being caught in the dragnet of sanctions. They will be cautious. Already, I found it very interesting that the AIIB, essentially the Chinese-led new multilateral bank, suspended its projects involving both Russia and Belarus, you know, signaling that they were going to side in that particular case with the more kind of multilateral types of institutions and networks. However, domestic, in terms of bilateral relations and the kind of deals that they can cut, I think the Chinese will be looking to exploit this. You know, very honestly, I think it's bargain basement shopping time for China and Russia. You see a collapsing ruble, you see no choice but to pivot to the east. Your distressed assets across a number of portfolios. The Russians have always been hesitant to sort of allow Chinese to buy their most strategic assets. They're going to have no choice now. So I actually think, you know, Beijing will navigate this as best they can, but I think the end game is clearly to increase the asymmetry and this asymmetrical strategic partnership that China and Russia have, and both sides are going to put a very good public face on it. But that's what's going to happen. My sense anyway.
How about
Yeah,
you?
total agreement. It is bargain shopping time for China. The other thing that's happening to China, though, is high LNG prices going into Europe are going to hurt China's purchases of LNG. So that is a real incentive for them to maximize gas through the Power of Siberia pipeline and go ahead with Power of Siberia 2. Now, even when you take those two gas pipelines together, that is still going to be half of the volumes that Gazprom exports to Europe. But still, it's a clear direction for China to save money from its LNG expenses.
Well, we've gotten several questions from the audience, so maybe I'll start posing some of those questions. And I want to start with one from someone I think both of you know, Ambassador George Kroll, who is former U.S. ambassador to not only Kazakhstan, but to Uzbekistan. And George has said, you know, other than, I'll kind of paraphrase what he said, but other than punishing the Russian economy and other economies dependent on the Russian economy, I mean, what could be, and this is what I alluded to, and I think you alluded to, Alex, before, what can be the achievable, realistic goals of the sanctions? So, you know, will they stop Russian actions in Ukraine, leading to perhaps getting Russia to the diplomatic negotiation table? Or will it be something different? Will there be a Russian capitulation? Will there be a change of leadership in Russia? He's posed a lot of questions here, but you know, I guess in the end, do both of you think that we've established that these are unprecedented sanctions that probably, you know, a month ago, no one, even myself, would have believed that we could have put together so quickly? But you know, will they make a difference, and how can we use those perhaps to get Russia to, you know, to the diplomatic negotiation table?
Well, I would just say Ambassador Kroll's questions are probing and insightful as always. And look, not only are there limits on what sanctions can do, but sanctions have to serve some sort of political process, some sort of political outcome, a set of clear goals. Because the longer they're in effect, you know, the more likely it is that you start having the breaking of the ranks in the sanctions regime. But the longer also that Russia has to start negotiating and innovating workarounds to these various sanctions. And so the reason they're so powerful is exactly because we have these important choke points: the use of the dollar or the euro, the SWIFT messaging system. The minute we start getting innovation, how to work around those choke points, this weapon that we have starts to diminish its value. I don't think this should be tied to regime change, even though I'm of the belief now that really we do need a change of leadership to somehow get us out of this mode in Russia, because again, this is Putin's vision that Ukraine needs to be part of Russia, and he's chosen the maximalist vision. We know that he didn't share many of these plans until the very last minute, even with his inner circle. But articulating so in public is a non-starter, and it's probably one of the worst things you can do to an already embattled and insecure autocrat in command of a nuclear arsenal. But what I'd like to see is, as soon as possible, if and when we have a serious negotiation and a framework for peace, to have it tied to certain benchmarks there, and eventually to the end game there, that can give us not only a ceasefire, but some sort of durable framework. What that is yet, it's still, I'm afraid, too early to say, because I think both sides feel as if they can make inroads on the battlefield.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any thoughts on that, Steve?
Yeah, two points, and there's one very important point to make on sanctions, which is, I hope that the U.S. Congress resists the tendency to write these sanctions into law, like they did with CATSA in 2017. Because if you do that, you have taken away so much of the incentive of the Kremlin to withdraw, to change, to bend. Because you get in, this is a knowledgeable audience, so they'll understand this. You get into the Jackson-Vanik trap, where the sanctions become generational. So we have to avoid that to give them the chance to have this effect on flexibility of the situation. The other thing I would say is there's an aspect to the sanctions that's long-term and important, which is these sanctions are sending a message to the successor generation of Russian leadership, whenever that successor generation arrives, that you cannot behave in this adventurous and criminal manner and expect to have a thriving economy. So not an immediate benefit here, but one that's necessary for the long term.
Mhm. Well, we have another question from one of our Board of Trustees, Richard Howe, and this is, I think, a little bit similar, but, from different perspective. And again, I'll paraphrase. There's some speculation, he says, that sanctions, especially those on oligarchs, would put pressure on Putin's ability to continue to hold on to the Russian people. And yet, and to hold on to power. And yet we've seen that, with the crackdown and shutting down of media, independent media, that perhaps, and we hear these things reported in the US media, that people from Ukraine will call their Russian family members, and they believe what they hear on the Russian media. They don't believe what their family members have told them. So, Russians have fled Moscow and St. Petersburg, perhaps to other parts of the former Soviet Union. But, one of the things that I think that this could be, could the sanctions actually do the reverse of what we want them to do, because it rallies the Russian people around Putin, because they don't really know the full story, and they think that Russia is being persecuted by an adventuresome West and, NATO, because that's been one of Putin's, one of his suggestions is that NATO is the aggressor, and he has to protect himself. But do you see any way where the sanctions could actually backfire and make people rally around Putin?
Yeah, I think that's an insightful question. I mean, we're witnessing something absolutely remarkable in terms of Russia's ability to completely control the media space, right? We had always, in the academic community, sort of contrasted Russian-style censorship with Chinese-style censorship, right? And that the Chinese used actual, blocks, hard walls, different ways to control the flow of information, whereas the Russians like to massage the narrative, right? Like to sort of give incentives to toe the party line. But, the shutting down, the restriction, even calling this a war, the shutting down of Echo Moskvy, the last sort of independent newspapers, the mass exodus of Russian journalists, according to one account, 150, might even be double that now, has to give us pause as to whether correct information is going to be able to make itself there. And I don't have a good prediction on this. I used to think, well, eventually an unpopular war, lots of casualties, inevitably you will get that flow out. But it's exactly what you said. This prior that the West had it out for us, right? They're the ones who wanted this conflict. They want to punish us en masse. And that actually, the opprobrium then that goes with that, the exclusion from these international sporting federations and competitions, these kinds of cultural events, all adds to that sort of under siege kind of mentality. My colleague Tim Fry has run some survey experiments where he does see a kind of a rally around the flag attempt. So I'm afraid, I'd be happy to be proven wrong on this, but I'm afraid it seems to me that a sanctions regime of this intensity tends to confirm priors. The big variable here is, can we create some sort of independent media space here to wrest away the narrative from the Kremlin? But so far it doesn't look good.
You have anything you want to add on that, Steve? Go ahead.
In that regard, there's a big potential own goal out there, and those are the proposals to de-link Russia from ICANN. So from the internet network. And, we've worked, I'm an old line Soviet guy like George and others. And, we worked so hard to penetrate the Soviet information space, and the internet does that now. So we have to preserve and nurture those informational links going into an increasingly dictatorial Russia.
We have another question, which I think is interesting, and especially for both of you who are scholars of former Soviet Union. And this is from Tom Kono, who's a colleague of ours from the UN. And it said, Can Russia mobilize members of the Collective Security Organization, the CSTO, whose Article 4 established a security alliance similar to Article 5 of NATO? So, you know, if Russia can claim that they're being attacked, especially, and I think this is why we have to be careful about what we actually do in Ukraine and how we support them. But, you know, could they call on, and would the other CSTO countries, you know, come to their defense? And also, speaking on another multilateral organization, and could Russia get support from the Shanghai Cooperation Organization? I mean, those are two, I don't know, having served in Central Asia and countries of former Soviet Union, I know that, you know, the countries are in the CSTO, but I would find it hard to think that they would come to Russia's aid if called upon. But I don't know, what do you two think?
Yeah, I would have agreed with that fully prior to what happened in Kazakhstan in early January. We saw the CSTO deployed for the first time. You know, the Russians turned that around, sent troops in support of Tokayev in what seemed to be not only to quell demonstrations, but an inner power struggle with factions loyal to former President Nazarbayev and some political allies and ruling family members. And the signal there was more symbolic. It wasn't because of the combat role that they had. They guarded important assets like Almaty Airport, Baikonur, Cosmodrome, and sort of signaled that the Kremlin backed Tokayev. It was a kind of a protective associational role that they played, and then they left very quickly. This was like tailor-made for the CSTO. They didn't actually have to get their hands dirty. They didn't have to pick sides the way they were being asked to in 2010 in southern Kyrgyzstan, potentially, when you had ethnic clashes there between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And everyone wondered whether Putin had some chip and that he would try and cash in with Tokayev. Now, it seems as if the Kazakhs are standing firm. They don't want anything to do with this. I think you're in a better position to talk about the Tajik calculation here, especially in the post-Afghanistan war, given the insecurity on that border. It does seem that they're trying to strong-arm Japarov. And if I would say there's one weak link, it would be the Kyrgyz premier, who seems also to be, quite frankly, a transactional president when it comes to matters of foreign policy. I don't think the CSTO as an organization is going to get involved, but I would just take 2 minutes to consider Belarus's role here. This is very significant. It complicates matter in decision-making and escalation potential in a way that just wasn't the case in 2014. In 2014, Lukashenko positioned himself as a convener, Minsk II. In fact, the Kremlin was very displeased with him for a considerable period of time afterwards for not having more firmly backed the stance. And also Lukashenko held out in 2008 against the recognitions of Abkhazia and South Ossetia and so forth. Now that Belarus is essentially an ally of Putin, and it's still unclear what, you know, they've certainly allowed territory to be used, unclear whether they've allowed their troops to go in yet. This creates all sorts of complications, not least because of that Belarus-Polish border. And the symbolism of Belarus backing Russia, right, is, you know, a demonstration of the fact that other weak client states in the post-Soviet Union, for lack of a better word, might also be targeted and might have the squeeze put on them. So I think that's the one caveat I would put to that. This kind of, you know, Belarus-Russia partnership that you're seeing here is certainly concerning, might create some openings, but formally for the CSTO, no, and certainly the SCO is not going to want to get involved in any way in anything that has to do with a combat role. You know, they'll kind of affirm their respect for you know, the general principles and the three evils that they have, but they will want to steer, you know, well clear of this.
Yeah, I probably would agree with that. And I guess it would depend too on the stronger countries of Central Asia or other former Soviet Union might be more susceptible to this pressure than, say, Kazakhstan or other, you know, countries that, or Azerbaijan, you know, Armenia may be a different case, but I don't know, Steve, if you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I can't really improve on those answers. If CSTO countries come, they will not be willing participants. And if they do come, I'd expect to see them in peacekeeping, sort of rear echelon roles. but even that will be uncomfortable.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with both of your thoughts on that. We have another question from Hart Hollis, and this is going back to maybe looking at our friends and allies in the Middle East. And he said a little sidebar issue that he thought was alarming is, the press has reported that it's our overall policy position that Saudi Arabia and UAE officials refused to answer a phone call from Biden. That's what's being reported, but do you think that's something that's a concern? Because again, as we mentioned, Saudi Arabia and the UAE could play a key role in trying to help, especially our European allies. I know they're more focused on natural gas than oil, but still, how do we read that? Do you all have any thought? Maybe Steve, do you have a thought since you've been involved in energy?
Yeah, and again, I am a real blank on the Middle East, but in energy terms, I want to keep re-emphasizing it is price signals that will be dominant. Now, Saudi Arabia has swing capacity through their massive production, but in recent years, the swing producer in the world has been US shale oil.
Yeah.
So we're seeing that come back to life. That's going to be exercising the moderating effect here. And yeah, we'll be seeing high oil prices for quite some time, not least because we don't know the direction of European sanctions and sanctions more widely on Russian oil. But then what's going to happen, and we've seen this many times, price signals are going to bring producers into the market, oil consumption will ramp up, and then that leads to gradual price declines.
You have any thoughts, other thoughts, Alex, on that?
No.
Okay. We do have one from Neil Caldwell, who is working with us as an intern, and he's a graduate student at NYU. And it said, in light of some of the headlines today stating that Russia calls sanctions regime economic warfare, do you see a potential link between the severity of the sanctions regime and the military escalation of Putin? Again, this is what I'd call like a backfire that is what we talked about, where his people would rally around him. But do you think if he feels like he has no off-ramp, that he's going to just escalate as opposed to de-escalate and look for ways perhaps to stop the conflict?
I mean, that would have been my fear 3-4 days ago. I mean, the situation is changing all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly he used very loaded, very powerful language, which he's now using almost for everything. So it starts it starts to lose its power after a while. He had also positioned himself and say, we've thought through every contingency. Well, obviously they hadn't. And what we see is a little bit of give in the Russian position, right? They're no longer calling for regime change, according to Peskov anyway. Mm-hmm. They're calling for a process of demilitarization plus recognition of Crimea and the Donbass, which is, a difficult set of conditions for Zelensky to accept. So it seems like that's not going to get there. However, if this was to broaden to serious energy sanctions all over, then then maybe there is more of an analogy to Japan in 1940. I don't know, but I was concerned about that. But it just seems that the Russian statements at the moment seem to be indicating that they're willing to give a little bit, as opposed to escalate for now, anyway.
Yeah, I mean, what I'd say on that is it echoes the Russian statement of a few days earlier to the effect of, we have nukes, don't push this too far. Don't declare economic war because then would be at war. Russia has, if Russia persists, there are no easily identifiable, off-ramps to this. The only identifiable off-ramp is for Russia to back off of its invasion. So, it brings to mind this great statement that problems have solutions, dilemmas have horns. And if Russia persists in pushing forward with the invasion, then, it's going to have dilemmas in many different ways, including economic.
Yeah, and this is probably the last question we can take, but it's from Vlad Lupin, who's a special lecturer at Fairleigh Dickinson University. And, again, this goes back to perhaps Putin isn't necessarily affected by the sanctions, but his people are, and even perhaps some of the people around him who aren't considered oligarchs or as wealthy as some of the people who have been in charge of, industry. And could you envision a time where perhaps that, the people in the government might say to Putin, okay, is enough, because there is data to support, Putin's popularity perhaps could be waning among some. I mean, I think this is too early to tell, but I guess it goes back to the whole idea is how long can this be sustained, and who is going to, I don't want to use the diplomatic word, but who's going to, throw the towel in first? And do you think that there could be anyone, or is Putin just so, disconnected from his own people that, there isn't anyone who could maybe say, look, it's time to start figuring out a way out of this?
I mean, I think you saw in the way that he paraded this decision, just very publicly getting everyone to agree, being on the record. It was almost Stalin-like, and sort of the demonstration, the sort of theatrical effect. I think the problem is that, this gets back to the point about the oligarchs. The oligarchs are no longer as influential as they were in the early, or even, maybe even mid sort of 2000s, and instead the strongmen around him in the St. Petersburg clan, a lot of them are very ideologically hardcore and actually do buy into this and agree to it. So, my colleague Tim Fry sort of reminded me, there has never been a military coup in Russia or the Soviet Union in history, and if that's what we're banking on, boy, we really are in trouble. And so what is the mechanism through which that process of giving that feedback, giving better information to Putin about really what's going on the ground occurs? I'm just not seeing it. And gosh, I really hope I'm wrong here. But instead, what seems to me is this kind of classic authoritarian stagnation. You become more and more paranoid. You trust fewer and fewer people. You make yourself more isolated, and then everything rides upon you. That seems to be where we're at now.
Yeah, well, do you have anything you wanted to add, Steve? Or?
Just very briefly on leadership dynamics, I think we'll only understand it in retrospect. What we do know is it's not Khrushchev in 1964, where you had a collective leadership. So it is terra incognita for us.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, unfortunately, we do have a few more questions, but we will have to stop because we've run out of time. And for those of you who ask questions, forgive me if I paraphrase and it wasn't exactly the question you asked, but I want to thank both Ambassador Mann and Professor Cooley for a fantastic discussion. Unfortunately, I think we could probably all agree that, what President Biden has done, what our European colleagues and allies have done, are a good first step, an unprecedented step in imposing sanctions. But, will this make a difference? And what will be the final outcome for the people of Ukraine and for the people of the world? So, so anyway, I look forward to having another discussion, hopefully soon, where we're talking about what the end game is and that we've got a positive outcome. But it remains to be seen. So anyway, thanks to both of you for sharing your insights with us. And thanks to everyone in the audience for staying and, listening to a great discussion today. Thanks a lot.
Thank
Thanks.
you.